Hello and welcome to UCL's Centre for Artificial Intelligence 15-minute Meet Series, exploring all things AI. I'm joined today by Emre Kazim, who is a research fellow in UCL's Department of Computer Science and is also a member of the AI Centre. Emre, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark.
It's a pleasure to interview you today. So we begin by asking our participants, how have you been finding lockdown and remote working, and what challenges and opportunities has this presented for you?
So I guess we've been doing, like all academics, because we are academics, we can kind of work remotely in a more comfortable fashion as opposed to people who do more lab work or people who are actually working in industry, etc. So I don't want to say anything too negative. Actually, we've been quite fortunate in terms of the area that we're working in. I've been doing a lot of research. We've been doing a lot of paper writing. So COVID has been a kind of intense period of work. I've actually increased the amount of work I've done, but it's also opened up different opportunities. So because we're doing all of our meetings online, and because we're able to effectively, space has no longer become a problem. I'm having a lot more meetings internationally, and we're doing a lot more online events and online seminars and discussions. So it's been quite interesting, actually. It's been there has been a shift, but it's just been just as busy and maybe a bit more busy than normal.
That's great. Thanks, Emre. And we'll come on to some of those online seminars and series you mentioned there in a bit. But next question, could you tell us a bit more about your academic career journey to date?
So I actually did my undergraduate at UCL, and I did it in chemistry. And while I was doing my degree in chemistry, my undergraduate in chemistry, UCL at the time was one of the few universities to offer an exchange program in North America. So I went to Canada for a year, and when I was in Canada, I did an elective in philosophy. So little did I know the kind of consequence of that elective. But after I finished my master's in chemistry at UCL, I then went on to start a PhD in chemistry. It was actually called a chemical physics group at Cambridge. And I was there for some time, and I kind of had an existential crisis and decided that I'd probably be better off studying philosophy. So I moved back to London and I started a master's in philosophy, and I was working at the same time. I did my master's and did quite well. And one of my teachers, one of the lecturers, encouraged me to do a PhD. So I ended up doing a PhD in philosophy. I did it in German philosophy, and I did it in ethics. So it was very historical. It was very abstract, but it was all to do with the Enlightenment, to do with conscience, etc. It was very foundational ethics. After I finished my PhD, I got interested in new digital technologies because I had a cousin who was buying Bitcoin, and he was encouraging me to buy Bitcoin, saying, just put in X amount of money and you make an obscene amount after like a blink of an eye. And I said to my cousin, I'm not going to put money into something that I don't understand. So like a good academic, I ended up reading on the subject, and I looked at value exchange and how these things impact the structures of the state. And I started to write in this space. So so that's how I got into digital ethics, and it was just kind of accidental. And some of that work got picked up by some academics at UCL, and I started to work alongside engineers in the kind of ethics space of these new digital technologies. And this kind of rolled on into a postdoc at UCL in the computer science department, which I'm doing now. And it was to be in the engineering department whilst looking at issues of ethics, etc., in a way that's translatable to engineers and informs engineers.
That's great. Thanks very much, Emre. A very interesting career journey you've taken. Your specialization now, and we sort of briefly touched on it, is data ethics. Maybe you could tell us about how your interest formed and developed in respect to this area.
So initially, one of the major kind of opportunities of, let's say, this data that we're collecting, or this data age, or this information age, is that it can inform or direct policy, government policy, even in terms of a lot of industrial strategy, etc., etc. It could be data-driven, analytics-driven. And there's a huge amount of ethical questions that surround this kind of ubiquitous adoption of data and the use of data. And some of those issues are quite kind of foundational questions in philosophy. So, for example, issues of fairness, justice, how the data is being collected. That's an issue of political justice or surveillance and civil liberties. So there were these really quite foundational questions with respect to data collection and data per se, and the information age, that do relate to more general and the foundational questions in ethics and philosophy. So it's not actually that that big a leap to relate, say, foundational questions in ethics and philosophy to what the engineers are actually doing, to what industry is actually doing, because I think that these are questions that are probably going to, the social and political implications of these things are probably going to impact the coming century. Also, I think they're going to be quite profound and quite consequential, not just kind of technical, deeper questions about the nature of how we should organize our society. What does it mean to be human in the age of all this data collection, and so on and so forth.
Well, that actually leads quite nicely into my next question, which was how intrinsic, in your opinion, is data ethics in the future development and applications of AI technologies?
So I would say that what we're kind of realizing in our work is that there is huge overlap between data ethics, but also AI ethics. So AI ethics and data ethics are not one and the same thing. They're not synonymous with one another. So, for example, issues of fairness in data and issues of fairness in AI are not the same. And it's becoming more and more clear to me that AI brings about a whole host of moral issues that say not just data or data collection or issues to do with data privacy and so on and so forth bring about, but AI itself brings about a whole bunch of other problems. And I think that these are so I guess in a way it's probably more apt to say that I work on AI ethics now more than, say, data ethics, even though there's a huge overlap. The AI part of ethics has traditionally been very speculative. So, for example, people talk about the singularity, the point in which there's this kind of exponential growth in information or knowledge and so on and so forth. They talk about Terminator, these kind of dystopian futures of robots taking over and so on and so forth. But there are ethical questions that are much more granular, much more kind of apparent and present today in AI ethics, and they're questions that we're really interested in, super interested in. One particular question is whether or not any form of automation or any form of AI can be fair. So the question of fairness is a big one. And we have a whole bunch of kind of question marks around that, and we investigate it in different ways. And what's very important, I think I should probably emphasize this, is that I'm in an engineering department. Engineers are often, I think engineers can dismiss the social sciences, but I think there's also a very big danger, and I see this all the time, of the social sciences or let's say the ethicists or the anthropologists or the legalists, etc., dismissing what the engineers are doing. And I actually think the engineers, because they have a much more tangible understanding of the technology itself, their insights are invaluable and often the most informed.
That's great. Thank you very much, Emre. And on a related subject matter, how do you envisage the governance of AI technologies might change in the future?
So what we have with respect to governance is, again, another vibrant debate. So all of this is very early stage. And we have two kinds of approaches to governance. One, let's call it the non-technical approach to AI governance, which is articulation of values, working out a kind of hierarchy of responsibility, mapping duties to responsibilities. This is things like compliance, risk, reputational and institutional culture, business ethics, etc. That's one part of the kind of governance structure, and there are other, because companies and institutions already have governance structures. So you might not need a AI governance kind of a whole new scheme or schematic in that space. You could just try to integrate it. Some people are trying to do that. Some people think that no, the nature of the thing that we're doing requires its own kind of AI specific governance. The other aspect is technical governance. I suppose one could challenge whether or not we should use the word governance in that context, but some kind of oversight or some kind of mechanism of responsibility. And that's where we start to look at AI systems from a technical perspective. So to kind of technically investigate and to audit or to assure or to actually kind of probe these systems to see how they're performing. So what you'll find with kind of data protection impact assessments is that somebody often fills it in, columns and sections where you just actually scribble something in. In AI technical governance, we're looking more at kind of probing systems, using engineering questions being answered through engineering kind of probes and analysis, stress testing, and so on and so forth, or looking at the outputs in terms of bias and so on. So the kind of technical side of the AI governance is being led by kind of the engineering, well, let's call it discipline or community of trustworthy or responsible AI engineering practitioners and literature. So for example, David Barber's work on privacy is a big part of that. Dr. Koshiyama's work on robustness, on safety, how well these systems perform over time, and so on and so forth, with stress is a part of that. So there are very tangible engineering problems in the wider governance of AI systems, as well as the non-technical aspect of governance. And that's kind of where we are.
Thanks, Emre. Fascinating stuff. We could talk about that all day. But just moving on to another exciting thing you've been working on. So you're currently leading a new AI Insights lecture series at the AI Centre. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about this program of events.
So we're really kind of focused on actually operationalizing the AI ethics debate into tangible, concrete, kind of translatable, practical consequences. And one way of doing that is, of course, there are ways when you can have research programs, you can have whole kind of funding structures, etc. A more modest way of doing it is to create a community, is community building, or consortia building, etc. And we try to do this through as much interdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder engagement as possible. So we're hosting this AI Insight series at the AI Centre, where every week we'll have somebody representing the civil service, someone from civil service or a non-governmental organization, somebody from industry, and somebody from academia. And the idea is that everyone will present on a particular subject, and then we'll have a discussion and we'll open it up to the wider community. The aim of this is to have as much kind of knowledge exchange, networking, exposure as possible. So we're really about kind of inviting people into the conversation, not to just tell them, oh, here, this is what's happening in the engineering department, but actually to say, this is what's happening in engineering. Let's hear what's happening in civil service. Let's hear what's happening in industry, and just kind of facilitate this. Because I guess being in academia, we hold that kind of position where we can convene different communities from a position of kind of a neutrality. So the Insight series, hopefully it will grow. We've got a whole bunch of events lined up over the coming year and hopefully next year also. And it really is about kind of just building the community and facilitating this kind of knowledge exchange.
Great. No, thanks very much, Emre. We're really excited for that series and looking forward to seeing it come to fruition. Final question, if I may, a question we're putting to all our guests in the series. What future applications of AI most excite you?
I'm going to go against my industry and say that I think that the application of AI in fairness applications is could actually be a positive thing. So I'm people are super worried that the AI systems are going to amplify bias. But I think that if you can have a system and engineers can show explicitly, nakedly how the system works, then actually, ironically, you actually have an opportunity to intervene in historical bias. Whereas the problem of the black box of human beings, or opacity and bias in human beings, is something that we just haven't been able to solve. We just never been able to make any kind of dramatic intervention in. And it's just so explicit when it comes to machines, if you will. We know how they're performing, or we can probe how they're performing. So we have a more explicit way. So ironically, even though there is a big fear with respect to the fairness of AI systems and bias in AI systems, if it can be solved properly, or if it can be done in an appropriate way, connecting all the discussions of governance and so on, and auditing and assurance of AI systems, we might have an opportunity to make a positive intervention through these technologies. So that's the thing that most excites me. And it's more utopian than dystopian. I think there's plenty of dystopian voices out there. So I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic.
That's great. Well, Emre, it was a pleasure to speak to you on the 15-minute meet series and learn a bit more about your research and work. I really appreciate you giving up the time, and hopefully we can catch up with you again on the series in due course. But for now, thanks very much for speaking to us today.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you. Take care.